What's the riskiest decision you've ever made? And what happened next? When I was 24, fresh out of university and working a barely paying job in Seattle, I got a phone call that changed everything. My mother had relapsed, again, and Child Protective Services was looking for someone to take my 12-year-old brother, or he'd be placed into foster care. I was barely making ends meet. I lived in a studio apartment the size of a shoebox and didn't even own a car. But the thought of him being alone, lost in the system, wasn't something I could stomach. I said yes. Taking custody was the hardest thing I've ever done. I had to grow up overnight. No more late nights, no more irresponsibility. We struggled. There were days I didn't know how we'd make rent, nights I cried from sheer exhaustion, but we got through it. I watched my brother go from a scared, angry kid to a smart, kind young man. He graduated high school last year with honors and is now in college on a scholarship. Saying yes to taking custody was a risk, financially, emotionally, but it was the best decision of my life. It taught me that sometimes the biggest risks aren't about betting on yourself, but about betting on someone else and refusing to let them fall. When I was 27, I decided to take a year off and travel. Not the usual touristy stuff. I wanted to see the world the hard way, backpacking through less traveled countries. That's how I found myself alone in a tiny village in northern Mongolia, where barely anyone spoke English, and the nearest major town was a day's journey away. It was exhilarating, but also terrifying. One night, while camping alone in the steppe, I woke up to the sound of hooves outside my tent. I peeked out and saw a group of horsemen, nomads, surrounding my camp. My heart nearly stopped. I had heard stories, travelers being robbed, worse. But instead of panicking, I forced myself to stay calm. I stepped out, smiled, and offered them some of my supplies. It turned into an impromptu campfire gathering. We shared food, they showed me how to make traditional dumplings, and we drank fermented mare's milk. They weren't there to harm me, Spake. They were curious about the foreigner camping alone in the wilderness. That night taught me that sometimes the world isn't as scary as we think, but also that solo travel is a calculated risk. You have to trust your gut, stay respectful, and hope that goodwill goes both ways. I've traveled to 30 more countries since, but that night in Mongolia is still the one I think about when people ask why I take such big risks. At 25, living in Toronto, I was over 320 pounds. I had been overweight my whole life, and by then, I had just accepted it. Diets, exercise programs, I had tried them all and failed. One day, after a minor car accident, a doctor warned me that my weight was putting my life at risk. Heart issues, diabetes, all of it. It was a wake-up call. I decided to take a risk I had never dared before, completely change my lifestyle, no shortcuts. I quit my job to focus on my health full-time. I started cooking every meal, exercising religiously, and seeing a therapist to tackle the emotional baggage that came with years of unhealthy habits. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, physically and mentally. I lost friends who didn't understand, battled depression, and faced setbacks that made me want to quit every single day. But after 2 years, I had lost over 150 pounds. More importantly, I gained a life. One where I could hike, travel, and just exist without constant pain. That risk of betting everything on myself was the one that saved me. At 30, I had what many would call a dream job. Marketing director at a big firm in New York City, corner office, decent salary, prestige. But I was miserable. Working 80-hour weeks, dealing with toxic office politics, sacrificing my health and sanity. One morning, sitting in yet another meeting that felt like a waste of life, I opened my laptop and drafted a resignation letter. I didn't have another job lined up, no plan, no safety net. I just knew I couldn't do it anymore. Quitting felt like jumping into a void. Friends warned me I was throwing away years of hard work. My parents were horrified. But once the initial fear wore off, something incredible happened. I started sleeping better. I had time to think, to read, to breathe. Eventually, I started freelancing, then consulting, and now I run a small agency on my own terms. Walking away from that dream job was the hardest and best thing I've ever done. During college in Melbourne, I had a friend, Chris. We'd been close since high school, the kind of friendship that survived bad breakups, failed exams, and terrible parties. But as we got older, Chris changed. He became manipulative, controlling, quick to anger. I kept making excuses for him. He's just stressed, he's going through stuff. Until one night, after a massive argument where he humiliated me in front of a crowd, I decided I'd had enough. Confronting him felt like stepping off a cliff. I risked losing someone who had been a huge part of my life, but I told him, bluntly, that his behavior was toxic and I couldn't be his punching bag anymore. He didn't take it well. He cut me off, badmouthed me to mutual friends. For months, it felt like I'd made a huge mistake. I was lonely and doubting myself constantly. But over time, I built new friendships, healthier ones, with people who respected me. Looking back, standing up to Chris was the first time I truly stood up for myself. It hurt, but it was necessary. In 2015, I was 26 and working as a software developer in Berlin. A decent job, good salary, but I was bored out of my mind. Around that time, a friend introduced me to Bitcoin. Back then, it was still this weird niche thing. People laughed at it, called it monopoly money. I started small, buying a few coins here and there. But the more I learned about blockchain, the more obsessed I became. One night, after a particularly frustrating day at work, I did something insane. I cashed out my entire savings account, about $25,000, and dumped it all into Bitcoin. Everyone said I was out of my mind. My parents thought I had joined a cult. Even my tech-savvy friends thought I was being reckless. For months, nothing happened. The price barely moved, and I started doubting myself. Then, 2017 hit. Bitcoin skyrocketed. My tiny little investment turned into 6 figures almost overnight. I sold at the right time. Pure luck, honestly. And used the money to start my own software company. Taking that risk didn't just change my financial situation. It changed my entire life trajectory. I learned that sometimes the biggest payoffs come from the most uncomfortable decisions. But only if you're willing to sit with uncertainty longer than everyone else. When I was 19, I got obsessed with rock climbing, not the indoor kind with foam mats and harnesses, real climbing, on cliffs where one wrong move could end badly. One summer, a group of us decided to tackle a notoriously difficult route in the Rockies. I was inexperienced compared to the others, but I didn't want to seem like the weak link, so I agreed. Halfway up the route, I slipped. For a terrifying second, I dangled in the air, the rope biting into my waist. I hit the rock hard, scraping my arm badly, but luckily my harness held. Still, I was shaken. The injury wasn't serious, just bruises and a nasty gash. But it shook my confidence for months. I quit climbing for a while, rethinking why I was so willing to risk so much. Eventually, I came back to it, but more carefully, more respectfully. That fall taught me that risk isn't about proving something to others. It's about knowing your limits and pushing them responsibly. At 28, I packed up everything I owned into 2 suitcases and moved to Tokyo, a city I had never visited, where I didn't speak the language, and where I had exactly one contact, an old college acquaintance who said I could crash on his couch for a week. Everyone thought I was crazy. I had a stable job, a decent apartment, and no real reason to leave. But I was restless, stuck in a loop of predictability. I wanted something different, even if it scared me. The first few months were rough. I got lost daily, struggled with cultural differences, and missed home more than I expected. I worked odd jobs, teaching English, freelance writing, even handing out flyers in the street. But gradually, I built a life. I learned the language, made friends, found a job in a startup. Eventually, Tokyo felt more like home than the place I had left behind. It wasn't easy, but stepping into the unknown was the best decision I ever made. I discovered resilience I didn't know I had, and a version of myself I actually liked. When I was 21, I spent a semester abroad in Barcelona. I met this girl, Sophia, in a Spanish language class. She was smart, funny, and had this incredible ability to make everyone around her feel at ease. We became friends fast, spending weekends exploring the city, drinking cheap wine by the beach, talking about everything and nothing. By the end of the semester, I realized I had fallen for her. Hard. The problem was she had a boyfriend back in her hometown. I kept my feelings to myself, telling myself it wasn't worth ruining the friendship or making things awkward. But on our last night in the city, as we sat overlooking the lights of Barcelona from a hilltop, I decided to risk it. I told her how I felt, fully expecting rejection, or at least a gentle letdown. Instead, she smiled, leaned over, and kissed me. It turned out her relationship back home had been falling apart for months, and she had been just as afraid to say anything. We spent the rest of the summer traveling together, and though we eventually went our separate ways, that moment taught me something. Sometimes, it's worth risking a good thing for the chance at something great. Back when I was 24, working a dead-end office job in Manchester, I hit a point where every day felt exactly the same. I'd sit at my desk, shuffle papers, drink bad coffee, and count the hours. One night over beers, my friend jokingly said, "You know what we should do? Open a cafe." It started as a joke, but the idea stuck with me. I spent weeks researching. Leases, equipment, suppliers. I had a tiny bit of savings, just enough to cover maybe 3 months of living expenses. My parents thought I was insane. My friends were skeptical. But there was this tiny voice in my head saying, "What if it works?" I quit my job, drained my savings, and signed a lease on a small, run-down spot on a side street. The first few months were brutal. Some days we barely made enough to cover the electricity bill. I slept in the back room more than once because I couldn't afford rent elsewhere. But slowly, word spread. We started getting regulars. Students, artists, old guys who just wanted a place to read the paper. A year in, we broke even. 2 years later, we were profitable enough that I opened a second location. Today, that little cafe is still running, and I'm no longer living paycheck to paycheck. Taking that leap was the most terrifying thing I've ever done, but it also saved me from a life I didn't want.